Welcome back. Most revenge is loud. Accusations across dinner tables, documents thrown in faces. This one operates in complete silence. The protagonist removes herself from a will, one deliberate step backward. What makes that retreat devastating is what she already knows about the estate she is surrendering. You're watching Eternal Diary. The smell that pulled Vivian Liang back to the living was pipe tobacco, not the clean, woodsy tobacco of advertisements or memory. Gerald Liang's brand had always been Dunhill Early Morning Pipe, a scent that sat somewhere between sweet cedar and something faintly medicinal. And after 31 years of daily use, it had seeped into every surface of his study. The cracks between the bookshelves, the fibers of the Persian rug he had purchased in Istanbul in 1998, the particular grain of the oak desk that had been his father's before it was his. The smell was so embedded in that room that even after Gerald had officially quit 3 months ago at the request of his oncologist, it remained thick, patient, permanent. Vivian lay in her childhood bed and breathed it in. She was 23 years old. As she knew this the way you know a dream you've woken from. The certainty arrives a half second before the proof. The twin bed with the brass headboard, the pale lavender walls that Karen had repainted during a renovation in 2019, obscuring the height chart Vivian's mother had scratched into the original white plaster when Vivian was 6. The window that faced east and caught the November light in a particular way, flat and pale like a sheet of worn aluminum. The sound of the house settling in its morning quiet, the particular creak of the third step from the bottom of the staircase that Vivian had learned to step over by age 9. She was 23. She had also, approximately 16 hours before this moment, been 28 years old and drowning under 22 months of estate litigation in probate court, Bergen County, New Jersey. Vivian sat up, her hands, 23-year-old hands, softer than she remembered, without the ink stains accumulated during 2 years of law school or the stress eczema that had broken out along her left thumb knuckle during the worst of the creditor proceedings, lay flat against the lavender comforter. She pressed them against her thighs and felt the pressure, the reality of the sensation. She was back. The date was November 12th, 2021. She knew this because of the half-eaten bag of sour gummy worms on her nightstand, purchased from the gas station the previous night, in the particular frenzy of stress eating that had followed Gerald's announcement at the dinner table. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer, 8 to 14 months, the oncologist had told him. Gerald had repeated this to his family with the blank courtesy of a man reading from a script he had already memorized alone, in private, and had finished grieving before anyone else knew there was anything to grieve. Vivian remembered that dinner. She also remembered everything that came after it. She got up, moved to the window, and looked down at the driveway of the Saddle River house, a 5-bedroom colonial that Gerald had purchased in 1997 for $840,000 and which Zillow currently estimated at $1.2 million. A number that Vivian now understood was one of the cruelest fictions she had ever been permitted to believe. Sophia's white BMW sat beside Karen's silver Lexus in the driveway. Sophia Xu Liang, Karen's daughter from her first marriage. 24 years old, 3-inch acrylic nails even in November. Oh, the kind of person who photographed her breakfast and called it content. She had moved into the Saddle River house 2 years ago after her apartment in Hoboken became untenable for reasons that shifted slightly depending on which version of the story she was telling that week. She had a habit of calling Gerald Dad in a voice calibrated precisely between affection and performance, and Gerald, softened by age and illness and the particular loneliness of a second marriage that had long since settled into something more like a business arrangement, allowed it without comment. Vivian watched the cars in the driveway for a long moment, the November light stripping everything of warmth. Then she went to her desk, took out the yellow legal pad she used for law school notes, and began to write. She had approximately 14 months before Gerald Liang would die on a Tuesday morning in January, with the smell of hospital antiseptic replacing the pipe tobacco and a nurse's hand rather than a family member's in his. That was the timeline for the estate. It was also the timeline for almost everything else she intended to do. Her handwriting was slightly different at 23. Looser, less cramped than it had become during 18 months of court filings and creditor correspondence. She noticed this with the detached curiosity of someone cataloging an unfamiliar instrument and wrote the first item anyway, pressing the pen hard into the paper. Helen account. JTWROS retitling. Before February. She wrote for 30 minutes without stopping, the gummy worms untouched, the morning light sliding slow and colorless across the wall. When she was done, the list filled 4 pages. She folded them into quarters, tucked them inside the spine of her property law textbook. The irony of the hiding place was not lost on her, and went downstairs to make coffee. The house in the mornings had always operated on Karen's rhythms, not Gerald's. Gerald was a man who woke at 5:30, made himself instant coffee in a ceramic mug that said, "World's okayest dad," purchased by Vivian at age 11, the last truly thoughtless gift she had ever given him, and read the Wall Street Journal in his study for exactly 45 minutes before the household stirred. His mornings were quiet and self-sufficient, in the way of someone who had learned, somewhere in the middle years of a second marriage, that solitude was the only guaranteed freedom. But Karen woke at 7, and the house announced it. The particular violence of Karen's morning routine, the faucet turned on and off 3 times in the master bath, the sound of her slippers dragging on the hallway floor, the cabinet above the coffee maker opened and closed with slightly more force than necessary, had a rhythm that Vivian had clocked by age 16 and spent the next 6 years navigating around. Sophia woke when she wanted. Vivian poured her coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and looked at the backyard. The Japanese maple near the fence had already lost most of its leaves. Her mother had planted it. Helen Liang had planted it in 1996, 2 years before Vivian was born, in the optimistic first autumn of the Saddle River house, amid when she and Gerald had only just paid off the deposit, and the mortgage felt enormous and hopeful rather than merely enormous. Helen Liang had died in 2013 of ovarian cancer at age 41. Vivian had been 14. Gerald had remarried Karen Zhu 2 years later at a ceremony Vivian attended in the pale blue dress her mother would have liked and understood to be a transaction she was not a party to. She sipped her coffee. The Japanese maple was bare. The fence behind it was showing its age, one post slightly tilted, the gray wood split at the grain. Gerald had meant to replace the fence every autumn for 5 years and hadn't. The backyard looked the way the estate would look, Vivian thought, when you stripped away the appraised value and examined the structure underneath. Beautiful on the surface, quietly rotten at the joints. "Oh, you're up early." Karen Lang moved into the kitchen with the particular efficiency she brought to everything. No wasted motion, no small talk before she had assessed the room and its occupants and determined whether they presented any immediate complications. She was 54, slim in the deliberate way of a woman who counted what she ate and moved through the world treating her body like a professional obligation. Her hair was dyed a consistent shade of deep brown that stopped exactly 2 inches above her shoulders and had not changed in 6 years. "I have a 9 o'clock seminar," Vivian said. Karen made a sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite dismissal and opened the refrigerator. This was the shape of their relationship. Not hostile, not warm. Karen had never been openly cruel to Vivian. Omid had never issued ultimatums or forbidden access to Gerald, or done any of the obvious things a stepmother in a less nuanced story might do. What she had done, with extraordinary consistency over 9 years, was simply reduce the available air in any room Vivian occupied. She made Vivian feel, without ever saying it, that her continued presence in the house was a courtesy being extended, and that a gracious guest would think twice before pressing her luck. Vivian had spent 6 years of her first life interpreting this feeling as instinct, and the last 2 of it understanding it was a deliberate, years-long campaign of gradual erasure. "Your father wants to see you after class," Karen said, not turning from the refrigerator. "He has some paperwork things to go over." "What kind of paperwork?" "Estate things." Karen set a carton of eggs on the counter and turned. Her expression was neutral in a way that had taken Vivian years to decode. It was the neutrality of a person who has already made a decision and is watching to see how the other party will react to its consequences. "Nothing dramatic, just updating documents. You know how your father is. He wants everything organized." Vivian thought about the list tucked inside her property law textbook. "Of course," she said. "I'll be home by 3. In her first life, Vivian had not understood the estate. This was not stupidity. She had been 23 when Gerald was diagnosed and 24 when he died. And then she had been a second-year law student with a particular focus on constitutional law and the kind of clean, theoretical confidence that comes from studying rules in the abstract. She understood the law in the way a person understands weather by reading meteorology. She had not yet stood outside in it. What she had understood, or believed she understood, was the surface of things. The house in Saddle River, the commercial properties in Bergen County, the brokerage accounts, the business that Gerald had built over 30 years, and which had his name on the door in block letters that faced Morris Avenue. She had understood that there was a will, and that the will, in its most recent form, named her as the primary beneficiary of the estate, with a secondary provision for Karen and a token amount for Sophia. Oh, she had not understood that wills were not walls. In the 3 months between Gerald's diagnosis and the first change to his estate documents, Karen had worked with a precision that Vivian, watching it now from the remove of hindsight and 5 years of hard-earned expertise, could only describe as architectural. It was not loud. It did not involve confrontation or ultimatums or dramatic scenes. Karen understood that Gerald Liang was a man who responded to the gradual reshaping of context rather than to direct pressure, so she reshaped the context. She made sure that Gerald's moments of vulnerability, the post-chemotherapy afternoons when he was exhausted and nauseated, and the effort of clear thinking felt enormous, were spent with her and Sophia rather than Vivian. She made sure that Vivian's graduate school commitments, Maud her part-time job, her perfectly ordinary 23-year-old absence, became, in the narrative Karen constructed around Gerald, a pattern of neglect. She made sure that Sophia's presence in the house was reframed not as the 24-year-old freeloading that it objectively was, but as devoted caregiving. She did this slowly. She did this across months. And then, when the context had been sufficiently reshaped, she gently raised the subject of the will. In Vivian's first life, she had found out about the will change 2 weeks before Gerald died. The information came not from Gerald, but from a message Sophia had sent to her actual best friend that Vivian had seen accidentally over Sophia's shoulder at the funeral home. A pre-celebration, all rendered in the breathless syntax of someone who had never considered that being witnessed was even a possibility. Gonna get so much OMG the whole house and the investments, LOL karmic, I guess. Vivian had spent the next 18 months believing the fight was worth fighting. She had hired a probate attorney. She had contested the will on grounds of undue influence. She had built her case carefully, documented every angle she could find. She had also, simultaneously, been named executor of the estate in Gerald's original will, and had continued to function in that capacity while the contest played out, because removing herself from that role would have meant abandoning the administrative work entirely, and she had not understood yet why that particular detail would matter. So, and it was Marcus Webb who explained the mechanics of what was happening to her, approximately 14 months into the proceedings, in his office in Hackensack with a view of the parking structure across the street and a plate of stale shortbread biscuits between them that neither of them touched. Marcus Webb had been Gerald Liang's estate attorney for 22 years. He was 56 at the time of that conversation, a compact man with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who spend their professional lives delivering information that other people are not emotionally prepared to receive. He wore the same style of suit every day, charcoal gray, single-breasted, and his office smelled faintly of the coffee he drank from a stainless steel travel mug he refilled from a machine in the lobby 3 times daily. He had spread the documents across his desk and explained the estate to Vivian in the methodical, unhurried tone of someone who had learned that pacing was mercy. The Saddle River house, valued at $1.2 million, yes, but Gerald had taken out a home equity conversion mortgage, a federally insured reverse mortgage, in 2018, 3 years before his diagnosis. The balance on that loan at the time of his death had been $940,000. The reverse mortgage did not require monthly payments while Gerald was alive. Upon his death, the loan became immediately due in full. The house would need to be sold to service it. Net equity remaining to the estate, $260,000. The business, Liang Import and Distribution, Incorporated, operating since 1991, had been struggling for 4 years before Gerald's diagnosis. He had personally guaranteed 2 lines of credit and a small business loan totaling $580,000. Personal guarantees survive death and become claims against the estate. The business assets, liquidated, had yielded $190,000. The estate still owed $390,000. 3 years of accumulated federal and state income taxes, paid on extension and then not paid, totaled $195,000 with interest and penalties. The IRS had already filed a lien. Additional unsecured creditors, suppliers, and 2 personal loans from relatives Vivian had not known about. $78,000. Total liabilities, $1.603 million. Total estate assets after the house sale, $673,000. Net position of the estate, negative $930,000. And Vivian, Sant, who had been functioning as executor for 14 months and had distributed a total of $41,000 in estate assets to Karen for administrative household expenses before understanding that the estate was insolvent, was now potentially exposed to personal liability for those distributions. She had sat across from Marcus Webb and listened to this and felt something drain out of her. Not hope. She had stopped treating hope as a working currency about 6 months in, but something more fundamental. The sensation of having believed profoundly and sincerely in the solidity of a floor, and then the floor not being there. "There's one more thing," Marcus had said, with the specific inflection of someone saving the worst for last, not out of cruelty, but because there was a correct order in which hard information could be received. Here's the life insurance policy. Gerald's whole life policy from 1991, face value $250,000. Karen had updated the beneficiary designation in 2019. Karen was the sole beneficiary. The policy had paid out 6 weeks after Gerald's death. Life insurance was a non-probate asset. It passed directly to the named beneficiary, outside the estate, outside the creditors, outside the will contest, outside everything. Karen had received $250,000 in clean, unencumbered money while Vivian was drowning in debt proceedings. Vivian had looked at Marcus Webb and asked very quietly whether anyone had known about the reverse mortgage or the tax liens before Gerald died. Marcus had held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable and said nothing. That had been answer enough. She had driven home from that meeting in the dark, in January, tied in the kind of cold that made the road feel brittle beneath the tires. The court summons from a creditor was still in the passenger seat from that morning. She had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 4 months. She had lost 12 pounds. She had been 3 miles from home when the other car ran the red light. There were worse ways to leave a life. She had thought this in the half-second of impact. She had not been able to think of any at the time, but she had allowed that they might exist. Now she was 23, standing at the kitchen window of the Saddle River house, watching her mother's Japanese maple in the November backyard, and the coffee in her hand was still hot, and she had 14 months, and she understood exactly what she was holding. She understood it the way a surgeon understands a body that has been opened before. The Saddle River house was not an inheritance. It was a liability wrapped in a valuation number and decorated with the memories of a childhood she had not yet decided whether to mourn. The business was a negative number wearing the mask of a going concern. The investment accounts and personal property and commercial holdings that looked, from the outside, like the legacy of a hardworking man who had built something for his family. All of it was structurally compromised, honeycombed with debt, a house of cards that would require only the single predictable event of Gerald Lang's death to collapse into its actual shape. Vivian knew this. Karen did not. Not all of it. Karen knew about the reverse mortgage because she had been present when Gerald took it out, had signed the paperwork in the kitchen on a Tuesday in 2018 after Gerald explained it as a smart leveraging strategy. But she had not kept careful track of the accruing interest. She did not know that the balance had grown from $620,000 to $940,000 in 3 years. She had a number in her head. Something vague. Something like around 600, maybe a little more. And it had not occurred to her to verify it, because the house felt, as Karen operated from the assumption that all large, beautiful things were fundamentally permanent. She did not know about the full extent of the business loans. Gerald had been private about the business in the way that men of his generation often were, about financial difficulty. It was a species of failure that did not exist until it was named out loud, and Gerald had declined, consistently, to name it. She absolutely did not know about the tax situation because Gerald had been managing this with the specific optimism of someone who believed that next year's earnings would handle what this year's hadn't, repeatedly, for 3 years. What Karen knew, with crystalline certainty, was the appraised value of the house, the name of the company, and the face value of the life insurance policy she had changed the beneficiary on in September of 2019. She had done the math the way a person does when they see the attractive number and not the denominators. Sophia's math was even simpler. She had heard Karen use the word millions once or twice in the context of the estate, and that was all the arithmetic she needed. Vivian, standing at the kitchen window, drank her coffee to the bottom. She thought about the word that Marcus Webb had used in his office that night, near the end, when she had asked him whether the entire situation could have been avoided. He had said, architecture. An estate, he had told her, was only as safe as its architecture. And the architecture of most people's estates, especially people who built wealth through business and real estate, people who leveraged and borrowed and reinvested and personally guaranteed things in the optimistic heat of expansion, was often far more fragile than the surface suggested. And the difference between a woman who inherited $1 million and a woman who inherited a $300,000 debt, he had said, was usually not the estate itself. It was the knowledge of what to look for. She had understood this 18 months too late the first time. She set her coffee cup in the sink and went upstairs to get ready for her 9 o'clock seminar. She would learn everything she needed about estate architecture. She already knew most of it. She also knew exactly how to use it. The Helen account was the first move. It was also, in some ways, the most delicate. Gerald had opened it in 2004, when Helen was first diagnosed, and the costs of treatment, scans, specialists, experimental protocols that insurance declined to cover had made it necessary to keep money specifically earmarked and specifically accessible. He had titled it as a joint brokerage account with his wife, technically joint tenancy with right of survivorship, which at the time had been less a legal strategy than a practical convenience. When Helen died in 2013, the account had passed automatically to Gerald as the surviving joint tenant. He had never touched it again. Vivian had discovered this account in the original will reading 8 weeks after Gerald's death in her first life. At the time, it had held $183,000. 9 years of compound growth on the original $60,000 seed, which Gerald had never withdrawn because he had never been able to bring himself to think of it as money for anything other than what it had originally been designated for. He had called it Helen's account in his head, and in the single oblique reference he had ever made to Vivian about it. At a kitchen table in 2019, over a dinner where Karen was at her book club, and Sophia was wherever Sophia went when the house wasn't performing for her. The account had been absorbed into the probate estate in Vivian's first life. It had been part of the gross estate against which the creditors filed claims. It had disappeared into the machinery of the insolvency proceedings and emerged as a number on a court document. In this life, Vivian intended for it to disappear differently. She chose a Sunday in early December. Karen had taken Sophia to a weekend spa retreat in Pennsylvania, a December tradition that Karen had established shortly after moving into the house, during which she spent 48 hours in the particular expensive stillness of heated stone tables and mineral pools. Emerging refreshed, in a way that seemed designed to demonstrate to Gerald what a well-maintained life looked like from the outside. Gerald, during these weekends, became a different version of himself. The version that ate cereal for dinner without apology and watched old film noirs and did not perform the role of patriarch for anyone's benefit. Vivian had timed this. She knocked on the study door at 7:30 on Saturday evening, carrying 2 bowls of cereal and a general demeanor of someone who happened to be free and was not making a production of the fact. Gerald looked up from his film and accepted the cereal with the expression of a man who had not expected to be visited and found that he did not mind it. This was the part that required the most careful calibration, because it was not entirely a performance. Giz and Vivian understood that operating in the precise space between genuine feeling and strategic intention required an honesty with herself that most people could not sustain. She had loved her father. She still did, in the specific damaged way of someone who had spent years watching a person they loved make choices that had consequences the person could not fully foresee. Gerald Liang was not a villain. He was a man who had been lonely and had made a second marriage that served Karen's interests far more comprehensively than it served his, and who had been too proud or too tired to examine the shape of what he had built. She did not hate him for any of it. She simply understood it. They ate their cereal and watched 30 minutes of a film noir in which a woman in a white dress knew far more than the man standing next to her. And when Gerald laughed once, genuinely, at something the woman said to a detective that was clipped and entirely without sentiment. "You're more like your mother than you think," Gerald said at a commercial break. Vivian looked at him. He was 61 years old, and he looked it now in a way he had not 6 months ago. The cancer was doing something to the architecture of his face, redistributing weight, pulling the skin differently against the bone, making him look both smaller and more essential, stripped of the padding that professional success had added over decades. She was a realist, Vivian said. She was. Gerald was quiet for a moment. She could look at something and see exactly what it was, not what she wanted it to be. What it was. He set his cereal bowl down. I always admired that about her, and I was also scared of it. Vivian said nothing, which was the correct response. Gerald looked at the television. I've been thinking about the account. Your mother's account. He said it as though the thought had just arrived, which meant he had been carrying it for some time. I never touched it after she died. Couldn't bring myself to. It's still there, still in both our names technically, though she's been gone 9 years and my lawyer keeps reminding me it needs to be properly titled. I know about it, Vivian said. This was true. He had mentioned it in 2019. You mentioned it once. I've been thinking it should be yours. He said it in the flat, declarative way. He said things he had already decided and was not inviting argument about. Not part of the estate. Not part of all the arrangements. He moved his hand in a gesture that dismissed the entire apparatus of wills and lawyers and estate planning as a category of discomfort. Your mother put that money together for herself, and it grew because she wasn't there to use it, and I think it should go to you clean. Outside of everything else. Vivian allowed a moment of silence. Dad, she said, that's a significant amount of money. Karen might have feelings about... Karen's feelings about your mother's medical fund are not a consideration I'm interested in, Gerald said. He had not raised his voice. He rarely did. But there was something in the sentence, a compressed weight, a finality, that told Vivian exactly how far his patience with certain subjects had worn. Okay, she said. I'll call Marcus on Monday. Nilo will retitle it as joint tenancy with you. When I go, it passes to you directly. No probate. We show no lawyers, so no arguments. He picked his cereal bowl back up. Your mother would have wanted that. Vivian looked at the television. She had not orchestrated this moment as directly as she had anticipated needing to. She had prepared 3 approaches to the conversation, 2 of them more overtly emotional, one of them purely practical. And had not needed any of them. Gerald, it turned out, had been moving toward this decision on his own. All she had done was position herself in the space where it could be said out loud. Helen Liang, she thought. Realist. Thank you, Vivian said. She meant it. The film noir resumed. The woman in the white dress was doing something efficient in a kitchen that suggested she was not surprised by anything that had happened and had been managing it longer than anyone realized. The life insurance situation was more complicated. Vivian had spent approximately 6 weeks working through the mechanics of it in her first life's knowledge before arriving at a strategy that could plausibly work in this one. The challenge was that Karen had changed the beneficiary in 2019, a September afternoon in the dining room, over documents that a financial advisor Karen had hired independently had walked her through, and the change had been made with Gerald's knowledge and signature, which meant that in the ordinary course of events, the policy would pay out $250,000 to Karen upon Gerald's death. Us and Karen would use this money to service her immediate financial needs, while Sophia attempted to manage the insolvent estate. The insight was this. Beneficiary designations on life insurance policies were not permanent. They could be changed at any time by the policyholder, without notifying the current beneficiary, without their consent, without any requirement to provide a reason. Gerald was the policyholder. What Vivian needed was Gerald's consent to change the beneficiary, specifically to name Vivian as primary beneficiary and Karen as secondary. And she needed to accomplish this without Karen knowing that the change had been made. This required two things: an opportunity and a rationale. The opportunity arrived in the form of a Wednesday afternoon in January, 8 weeks after the diagnosis, during which Gerald had a post-chemotherapy appointment at Valley Hospital in Ridgewood, and Vivian had arranged, weeks in advance, to drive him. Karen normally drove Gerald to his appointments. But Karen had a dentist appointment that Wednesday that had been scheduled before the chemotherapy calendar was finalized. And rather than rearrange it, she had asked Vivian, with the particular phrasing of someone extending a low expectation request, whether Vivian might be able to cover it. Vivian had said yes. She sat in the waiting room during Gerald's infusion and thought about the rationale. She had ruled out the emotional approach. You're my biological daughter. I have no one. I should be protected. Because Gerald was a man who made financial decisions on the basis of logic rather than sentiment. And because appeals to sentiment from Vivian specifically would register to him as out of character and therefore suspect. What she used instead was a number. On the drive back from the hospital, Gerald gray and quiet in the passenger seat, the car smelling of the hand sanitizer he used compulsively post-chemo, and the particular cold air of a New Jersey January that came through the vents slightly metallic, Vivian waited until they were on Route 17 and then said, without preamble, I was looking at graduate housing options in the city, trying to understand what I'd need if I transferred programs next year. Gerald looked at her. You're thinking about transferring? Maybe. I don't know yet. This was true. In this life, she had not yet made the decisions she would eventually make. Oh, but I was running numbers and I realized I don't have a safety net of any kind. If something happens to me, or to... She let the sentence rest a moment. I have no beneficiary designation on anything. I have nothing in anyone's name. I realized I've just never thought about it. A pause. Neither did your mother? At 23. Gerald said. Right. Vivian watched the road. I was thinking about your policy. The whole life one. I know Karen is listed on it. I understand why. But I was wondering, not asking you to change everything, but whether there might be a way to just have something set aside specifically for me. Something that's mine if the worst happens, and I'm without resources. Gerald was quiet for what felt like a very long time. I named Karen because it was the practical thing at the time, he said. She's my wife. Well, it made sense. Of course. But your mother had nothing when she got sick. Nothing in her own name. We scrambled. He said this with the flatness of an old wound that had finished hurting and become simply factual. I don't want you to scramble. Vivian said nothing. I'll call Marcus, Gerald said. We'll change it. Primary to you, Karen remains secondary. Vivian watched the road. Don't mention it to Karen, Gerald said. She'll want to have a conversation about it, and I don't have the energy for that right now. Of course not, Vivian said. She drove the rest of the way home in the gray January light and did not speak, and kept her face exactly as it had been. She changed the beneficiary designation through Marcus Webb's office 4 days later. The policy had a face value of $250,000. Some of the months between January and October had a particular quality that Vivian would not have known how to describe to anyone who had not lived a version of them before. Time moved the way it moves in a house where someone is dying, in 2 registers simultaneously, with the days feeling both slow and irretrievable, as though each one were both endless and already gone. Gerald went through his chemotherapy and his bad weeks and his occasional better weeks with the stoic economy of a man who had decided privately that this was the shape his death would take, and who was now primarily interested in managing the process rather than lamenting it. He worked from home as much as he could. He continued to read the Wall Street Journal in the mornings. He ate what Karen put in front of him when he could eat it all, Anno with the detached compliance of someone for whom food had become purely instrumental. Karen ran the household with intensified efficiency. She had the particular energy of a person who is managing a high-stakes project and knows it. In the way she dealt with Gerald's doctors, in the way she organized his medications, in the way she navigated the household's altered rhythms with a minimum of visible disruption. Vivian watched her and understood, in a way she had not the first time, that Karen's management of Gerald's illness was simultaneously genuine caregiving and tactical positioning. The two things were not mutually exclusive. So this was perhaps the most important thing Vivian had learned across 2 lifetimes, that people could sincerely care for someone while also being entirely clear-eyed about what that person's death would mean for them. Sophia's contribution to the caregiving operation was primarily atmospheric. She was present, she was warm, she made Gerald tea at specific times, and watched television with him on the evenings when Karen had charity committee obligations and Vivian was at school or work. And she called him Dad in that calibrated voice and rested her head briefly on his shoulder in a way that was photographically perfect. The kind of gesture that would look exactly right if anyone were watching, which she always seemed to assume someone was. Gerald was not impervious to this. He was a man who had grown up in a family that did not discuss its interior weather, and who had, consequently, spent most of his adult life somewhat starved for the simple texture of domestic warmth. Sophia provided this in abundance and at low cost to herself, and Vivian, watching it from across the kitchen or the living room, did not begrudge it. Gerald deserved to be warm. It was not his fault that the warmth was being delivered by a person whose primary interest was in the temperature reading rather than the fire. Vivian played her part. Her part was the one they expected, the somewhat distant biological daughter who cared but was busy, who showed up reliably but not effusively, who had a slightly guarded quality in family gatherings that could be read, by anyone who wanted to read it that way, as residual resentment. She did not overperform warmth. She did not underperform presence. She visited twice a week, cooked occasionally, drove Gerald to 2 more appointments, asked about his clients in the way he liked to be asked, specific questions about specific projects rather than general inquiries about whether he was managing, and listened to his answers with the attention of someone who understood that being genuinely interested in a person was more useful in almost every context than performing interest. She was also, concurrently, doing other things. In February, she had approached the question of her own financial position with the comprehensive seriousness she had spent the second half of her previous life wishing she had applied to it the first time. She had her law school stipend, a part-time job at a property management firm that she had taken specifically because it gave her access to commercial real estate data. And she had, via the joint account that Marcus Webb had formally retitled in January, the theoretical future access to $183,000 that was growing at approximately 7.2% annually in a brokerage account she had no interest in touching before it was hers by operation of law. What she did with her own money was different. In March, she opened a brokerage account in her own name and funded it with $8,000 from her savings. She had known since 2019 in her first life that a particular commercial real estate company she had done research on during the estate proceedings, Meridian Commercial Properties, Inc., the mid-size REIT that had been expanding aggressively into secondary markets, was going to double in value within 18 months as it was acquired by a larger institutional investor. In her first life, she had been researching it in the context of whether Gerald's commercial properties were affected by a larger market trend, too late and in entirely the wrong context to benefit from the knowledge. In this life, she bought 400 shares at $19.47 in March. She also bought 3 months of intensive study in estate law, property law, and financial planning, spending her weekday evenings and Sunday mornings working through the material she had absorbed through necessity in her first life and through design in this one. She sat for her Series 65 examination in July and passed. She had always been a methodical studier. She was a better one now. She was building the architecture she would need, not for the estate, for her life. In May, she had a conversation with Marcus Webb that was, on its surface, a law student asking a local attorney if she could observe his practice for a practicum credit. Marcus Webb was the kind of person who said yes to this kind of request. He had a pedagogical impulse that expressed itself in a willingness to explain things in detail to people who appeared genuinely interested. And Vivian appeared genuinely interested because she was. She sat in his office twice a week for 6 weeks, asked careful questions about probate proceedings and his estate insolvency, and the specific mechanics of how secured and unsecured creditors made claims against insolvent estates. She never mentioned Gerald by name. She never mentioned her own situation. She framed every question in the third person. Her professor had assigned a case study. She was preparing for a clinic placement. She wanted to understand a particular point in the reading. Marcus Webb explained the mechanics with the patient specificity that Vivian had come to associate with him from their later conversations in her first life, when the mechanics he was explaining were the ones dismantling her. She learned about disclaimer of inheritance, the legal mechanism by which a beneficiary could, within 9 months of a decedent's death, formally refuse all or part of an inheritance, allowing it to pass as though the disclaiming party had predeceased the decedent. She had not needed this in her first life because she had not been given anything to disclaim. The will contest had still been active when the estate's insolvency became apparent, but she filed the knowledge away. She learned about the personal liability of an executor who distributed estate assets before all valid creditor claims were satisfied. This was the mechanism that had threatened her in her first life. The $41,000 distributed to Karen that became a potential personal liability when the estate went underwater. She learned precisely where the bright line was and exactly how to stay on the right side of it. She learned about the specific accelerating provisions of HECMs, home equity conversion mortgages, the federally insured reverse mortgage product Gerald had used. She learned that upon the death of the last surviving borrower, the lender had the right to call the entire loan balance due within 30 days, with a grace period of up to 12 months for the estate to sell the property. She learned that interest accrued daily and that many borrowers' families, discovering the existence of the HECM for the first time at the time of death, found themselves facing a balance significantly larger than they had anticipated. She thanked Marcus Webb for his time at the end of the practicum period and brought him a tin of Earl Grey from the specialty tea shop on Main Street that she had observed him purchasing from on 2 occasions. He accepted it with the slightly surprised pleasure of someone who is not often the recipient of considered gifts and does not quite know what to do with the feeling. She did not tell him who she was. She would not need to later. He would figure it out. The will change happened in August. Karen had been laying groundwork for months. Vivian knew the approach by its specific texture, the suggestions embedded in practical conversations, the way she drew Gerald's attention to Vivian's absence without naming it, the way she made Sophia's presence synonymous with the particular domestic stability that Gerald, exhausted, medicated, incrementally diminished by the cancer's slow progress through his body, was most dependent on. There was also the matter of the business. Gerald had always intended that whoever inherited the business would inherit the responsibility of managing it. This had been implicit in the original will, which left the business interest to Vivian with a bio provision for other heirs. In August, Karen raised, with the specific timing of someone who had been waiting for the right post-chemotherapy Thursday afternoon, the question of whether Vivian was actually equipped to manage a business. Vivian was in law school. Vivian had no commercial real estate experience, no import-export experience, no management experience. Sophia had been helping with some of the administrative work at the business. This was true. Karen had maneuvered her into this position specifically to be able to say so, and had really come into her own in the past few months. Gerald, in the space between his 3rd and 4th infusion cycle, facing an autumn of diminishing energy and accelerating medical complexity, made the calculation that Karen had been guiding him toward. He told Karen he wanted to update the will. Vivian found out from Gerald directly. He on a Sunday afternoon in late August, in the study with the pipe tobacco smell and a cup of the green tea he had started drinking since the coffee became hard on his stomach. He told her with the directness he had always applied to uncomfortable information. The estate would be restructured. Sophia would be named primary heir of the estate. Vivian would receive a specific cash bequest of $15,000 from the estate and would of course have her mother's account, which they had both agreed was handled separately. He told her this as though it were fair. He might have believed it was. Vivian looked at her father's face, at the specific new terrain of his illness. The way his eyes had acquired a quality of apology that she had never seen in them before, and that she suspected was not directed entirely at her, and she performed the response that was required. She argued. She argued in exactly the measure of intensity that a genuinely wronged daughter would argue, and no more. Present, specific, wounded, but ultimately bounded by love for a dying man, she was not willing to torment about a decision he had clearly already made. She raised the fact that she was his biological daughter. She raised the years she had spent assuming she would be cared for. She mentioned her mother, once, briefly, and watched Gerald absorb the mention with the expression of a man standing in a wind he had created and finding it colder than he anticipated. Then she conceded. "Well, I don't want to spend our time on this," she said. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone working to control it, which was exactly the impression she needed to give. "You're going to do what you think is right. You always have." Gerald was quiet. I want you to know that this feels like a loss," Vivian said. "Not the money. You. I want you to know that." Gerald reached forward and put his hand over hers on the desk briefly and then took it back. "I know," he said. She went home. She was renting a room near campus now, had been since September. Which had the double advantage of giving her independence and making her absence from the Saddle River house more visible and therefore more narratively useful to Karen's campaign, and sat on the edge of her bed in the particular quiet of a rented room and understood that the performance had been as good as she could make it, and that it had served its purpose. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb's office filed the updated estate documents. Sophia Shu Liang, primary beneficiary of the estate of Gerald Liang. All real and personal property, all business interests, all commercial holdings, subject to the payment of debts and estate costs. Vivian Liang, cash bequest, $15,000. Sophia did not call to say anything. She did not text. 3 days later, she posted a photograph of herself and Karen at a restaurant in Englewood Cliffs. Lobster, a bottle of something that gleamed in the candlelight, with the caption "So grateful for family." Vivian saw it and put her phone face down on the desk and went back to the estate law material she was reviewing. She was almost done. There was one more element. In October, at a continuing education event for financial professionals in Newark, Vivian met Daniel Chen. Daniel was 29, a CPA with a specialty in closely held business valuations. The kind of professional who had a quality of precision that manifested in the specific way he organized the materials in front of him at a conference table, everything parallel, nothing wasted. He had a dry quality to his conversation that was not unkindness so much as efficiency. He did not perform interest, he didn't feel, which meant that when he directed his attention at something, it was unmistakably the real thing. They had coffee after the panel discussion in the lobby of the conference center, in paper cups that kept the heat poorly, and which both of them held anyway, because November in Newark demanded something warm. She told him, in the careful way she had learned to approach this kind of disclosure, that she had a family estate situation that was more complex than it appeared from the outside, and that she was trying to understand the valuation question on a closely held business with significant debt exposure. Daniel listened without interrupting. Then he said, "When you say significant debt exposure, are we talking about a balance sheet issue or a personal guarantee issue?" "Both," Vivian said. He nodded with the expression of a person who has just been given the precise piece of information they needed to understand what category of problem they are dealing with. And the family, do they know what the actual exposure is? "Some of them," Vivian said. "Not all of them." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He was looking at his coffee cup. "That's a difficult position to be in," he said. It was not sympathetic in the conventional sense. It was observational, which was, to Vivian, more useful. "Yes," she said. They exchanged information. He would later, in January, be the person Vivian called when she needed someone to explain a particular aspect of the business valuation in technical terms she could not access on her own, and he would explain it with the direct precision that she had come to expect from him. Without asking questions, she hadn't answered yet, and without making her ask for what she needed, in terms she found uncomfortable. She did not tell him the full picture until later. When she did, he did not say anything that most people would have said. He said, "You built the right structure. The non-probate extraction is clean. You're protected." That was all she needed. Gerald Liang died on a Tuesday in January at 6:47 in the morning. Vivian was 30 minutes away, in her rented room, when her phone rang. She drove to the hospital in the particular cold of a New Jersey January morning. The same month, the same quality of light, the same metallic edge to the air through the vents. She thought about the fact that she had made this drive before, in the other direction, in a different life, toward a different intersection. She thought about the court summons that had been in the passenger seat of that car. The passenger seat was empty now. She parked in the hospital garage and sat for a moment in the engine-warm silence. Gerald Liang, 61, had been building something for 32 years. And the thing he had built was not exactly what he thought it was. And he had died without fully knowing the shape of it. This was not a tragedy unique to him. Most people died without fully knowing the shape of what they had built. The question was not whether you understood the full shape. The question was who was standing closest when it revealed itself. She went inside. Karen was in the waiting area outside Gerald's room, all composed and red-eyed in the specific way of a woman who has been crying and has stopped and does not intend to resume until she is somewhere more private. Sophia was beside her with her hand on Karen's arm in the photographically correct position. They looked up when Vivian entered. Vivian looked at her father's wife and her father's wife's daughter and thought about nothing in particular. "I'm so sorry," she said. She meant it in the exact measure that it was true, which was a moderate measure, and she said it in exactly that measure, which was the most honest she had been to either of them in months. The funeral was held the following Saturday at a church in Ridgewood that Gerald had attended sporadically, and whose pastor had apparently been expecting him more than Vivian had known. Yes, it was a gray day with a particular quality of stillness, the kind of cold that asks nothing of you and expects nothing back. About 60 people came, colleagues from the business, old clients. A cousin from California who had flown in and who Vivian knew had an informal loan outstanding of $35,000 that Gerald had never repaid and which the cousin had been too polite to mention for 4 years, but which she had filed in her memory as a claim she intended to make when the opportunity arose. Sophia wore a black dress that had been purchased recently, its darkness too uniform, not yet broken in by light or movement. She held Karen's arm and accepted condolences with a performance of grief that was, Vivian assessed, approximately 70% genuine and 30% practiced. She was good at it. She had probably not noticed the 30% herself. Vivian stood with her father's casket and thought about the Helen account, which was now hers, about the life insurance policy, which had been processed by the carrier already and would fund within 10 business days, about the Meridian shares, which had been acquired by the institutional buyer in November at $38.90 per share, netting her $7,772 in profit on a $7,788 investment, and which she had reinvested in a position that she expected to reach its full value by the following April. She thought about the word architecture. She thought about her mother's Japanese maple, bare in the November backyard and probably bare now in January too, its branches holding the specific stillness of a living thing waiting for the conditions to change. Ben DeMarcus Webb's office sent the estate notices in the standard form on the morning of January 18th, 8 days after Gerald's death. By February 6th, the first creditor notice had arrived. It came from the reverse mortgage servicer, Hillcrest National HECM Services, Inc., a company whose letterhead managed to be simultaneously bland and ominous, which Vivian understood was a deliberate design choice in the financial services industry. The letter was addressed to the estate of Gerald Liang and was copied to Karen Liang as the surviving spouse and to the named executor of the estate, which was, per the updated will, Sophia Zhu Liang. Sophia called Vivian at 9:30 on a Thursday morning, a timing that told Vivian she had been sitting with the letter since it arrived and had needed several hours before she could call. "Oh, there's a letter," Sophia said, and her voice had the quality of a person who has encountered a problem that is larger than their existing vocabulary for problems. "About the mortgage." "What kind of letter?" Vivian asked, which was not quite the honest question, and was the precisely correct one. "It's saying the mortgage is... They're saying there's a balance of $960,000. A pause. "That can't be right. The house is worth more than $1 million. Vivian waited. "That doesn't make sense," Sophia said. The voice was sharpening now, gaining an edge that had a quality of incipient panic beneath it. "There can't be a $900,000 mortgage on $1 million house. There would be no equity." "What kind of mortgage is it?" Vivian asked. A pause. The sound of paper. "It says, Home Equity Conversion Mortgage." Another pause. "What is that?" Vivian looked out the window of her apartment. The buildings across the street were gray in the February light, their windows reflecting nothing. "It's a reverse mortgage," Vivian said. "They don't require monthly payments. The balance accrues over time. When the borrower dies, the full balance becomes due immediately. Silence. "And the balance is $960," Vivian said. "So after selling the house, assuming it sells at appraised value, 1.2, the estate would clear about $240,000 before any other costs." The silence had a different texture now. "Are there other costs?" Sophia asked. Yes, and her voice had become the voice of someone who already knows the answer to the question they're asking, and is asking it anyway because not asking feels worse. Vivian thought about the $580,000 in personal guarantees on the business loans. She thought about the $195,000 in accumulated back taxes. She thought about the $78,000 in unsecured creditors. She thought about Marcus Webb's voice in his Hackensack office, methodical and unhurried, the shortbread biscuits untouched between them. "I think," Vivian said carefully, "that you need to call Marcus Webb before you open anything else." She heard Sophia breathe. "Vivian," Sophia started. "He'll explain the estate structure to you," Vivian said. "He knows everything. He's been your father's attorney for 22 years. He can walk you through what the obligations are and what the timeline looks like." "How do you know so much about this?" Sophia asked. Her voice had shifted again, not quite accusatory, but with a quality of suspicion that was feeling its way toward a shape it couldn't quite name. Vivian considered the question. "I'm a law student," she said. "I've taken property law, estate law. I've paid attention." A silence. "Call Marcus," Vivian said. "Today. Don't wait." She ended the call and set her phone on the desk. She thought about the day in her first life when Marcus Webb had spread the documents across his desk and explained the architecture to her, the flat, unhurried voice, the shortbread biscuits, the parking structure through the window. Now, she thought about what it had felt like to be the person receiving that information, the specific sensation of a floor that had seemed solid, revealing itself to be something else entirely. She felt it now in the particular way of a person who has lived something before and is watching it arrive from a different angle, not without feeling, just without surprise. The estate of Gerald Liang was filed in the Bergen County Surrogate's Court as an insolvent estate on March 14th, approximately 8 weeks after Gerald's death. The filing identified total estate assets of $693,000 against total creditor claims of $987,000 for a net insolvency of $294,000, a number that Marcus Webb described in his affidavit as reflecting, in the formal language of probate proceedings, almost an estate in which the debts of the decedent exceed the value of the assets available to satisfy them. $300,000 in the whole. $6,000 of rounding error from the round number that most people would use to describe it. Sophia learned about each component separately, which was worse than learning about all of them at once. The reverse mortgage was first, in the letter. Then Marcus Webb's office walked her through the business loan guarantees in a 2-hour meeting on February 10th that Karen attended also, and which a paralegal who had been at the firm for 12 years later described to a colleague as one of the more memorable client meetings she had witnessed in terms of the specific quality of silence that fell over the room when the personal guarantee liability was explained. The back taxes came third. Also in a letter from the IRS that arrived on February 19th, and which Sophia called Vivian about at 7:15 in the morning without apparent awareness that 7:15 was early. "Vivian," she said the name with the flat compression of someone who has run out of a more specific emotional vocabulary. "The IRS is saying Gerald owes $195,000. "In unpaid taxes," Vivian said. "Yes." A pause. "You knew?" "I suspected there might be tax exposure," Vivian said, which was the exact truth. "How long have you known?" "Sophia," Vivian said, "I'm not the executor. I'm not the primary heir. I didn't have access to the estate documents until after Gerald died. And what I've seen I've understood through my legal education." A silence that had the quality of a person recalibrating their assessment of a situation while standing in the rubble of the previous one. "I have $15,000 in this estate," Vivian said, "which, given that the estate is insolvent, I'll probably never see." This was true. Cash bequests were general legacies, paid after secured and priority creditors, which in an insolvent estate meant they would not be paid at all. She would not receive her $15,000. She had also never expected to. "What about the—" Sophia started. What about your mother's account? The joint account Gerald retitled? That's a non-probate asset, Vivian said. It passed to me directly at Gerald's death by operation of law. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. It's not part of the estate. Another silence. And the life insurance, Sophia said. Her voice had become very flat. Not a question. Gerald named me as primary beneficiary, Vivian said. Last January. It's a non-probate asset. Same principle. It passes directly to the named beneficiary outside of the probate estate, outside the creditors, outside everything. She heard Sophia's breathing. She heard the particular quality of a person understanding, not all at once, but in a series of descending recognitions, the full shape of what had happened. You knew, Sophia said. Her voice had lost its flatness and found something underneath it. Not quite anger yet, still forming. I knew that the estate had significant undisclosed liabilities, Vivian said. I knew that an inheritance is not the same as a number on a Zillow page. I knew that before any of this was my problem, it was going to be yours. You let us... I told you to call Marcus Webb, Vivian said. On the day the first letter arrived, I told you to call him before you opened anything else. Did Karen call Marcus Webb? A silence. Not immediately, Sophia said. No, Vivian said. Karen read the HECM letter, and she called a real estate agent because she assumed that selling the house would solve the problem. She waited. Did the real estate agent explain what a HECM was? Nothing. The house was always going to have to be sold, Vivian said. What matters is what's left after the sale. And what's left after the sale goes to the mortgage servicer, and then to the federal government, and then to the business creditors, and then to the personal creditors, in the order that the law dictates. There won't be anything left for heirs. You could have told us, Sophia said, and there was something in the voice now. Not just anger, something raw and less directed. The sound of someone who has just understood that they have been standing in a building without a foundation for a long time, and that the person who knew this is currently standing in a different building entirely. Vivian thought about the Saddle River house, the Japanese maple her mother had planted, the height chart scratched into the plaster that Karen had painted over in 2019, the study with the pipe tobacco smell. You could have found out, Vivian said. You had access to the same documents I did. You had the same estate attorney. You had more access to Gerald in the last year than I did. She paused. You chose not to find out. Well, that's different. Sophia said nothing. I suggest you focus on the estate administration, Vivian said. Marcus Webb will guide you through the insolvency process. You'll need to coordinate the house sale, the business liquidation, and the creditor priority schedule. It's a lot of administrative work. You'll want to be careful not to distribute any assets before all creditor claims are satisfied. Distributing assets from an insolvent estate before clearing debts can create personal liability for the executor. A brief pause. Marcus will tell you all of this. She could hear Sophia's breathing. Is there anything else? Vivian asked. A long silence. No, Sophia said. The call ended. Vivian sat in her apartment in the February quiet and looked at nothing in particular for approximately 30 seconds. Then she opened her laptop and navigated to her brokerage account. The Helen account, retitled, had finished processing the previous week. Combined with the life insurance payout and the proceeds from her Meridian position, she had, as of the current morning, $432,000 in liquid assets. In 2 months, when the secondary position she had built through the autumn reached its anticipated price point, that number would be closer to $490,000. She opened a new browser tab and pulled up the listing she had bookmarked 3 weeks ago. A 2-bedroom unit in a building in Jersey City that a developer she had been watching was about to list at below market for a quick sale ahead of a larger portfolio transaction. As the building was 6 blocks from a PATH station and 4 blocks from a park that the city had been quietly approving development permits around for 2 years. She had already spoken with the listing broker. She had already spoken with a mortgage lender. She clicked on the listing and reviewed the numbers one more time, though she had memorized them already, and then she picked up her phone and called the broker and told him she was ready to proceed. The broker asked if she had any questions. No, Vivian Liang said. I've reviewed everything I need to review. She ended the call and set her phone on the desk, face up, beside her open laptop and the untouched mug of coffee that had gone cold while she was on the phone with Sophia. And she reached for the coffee anyway, and drank it cold and did not make a face about it. Oh, outside the apartment window, the February sky was the particular gray of a thing that was neither ending nor beginning, just persisting, flat, and patient, in the way of things that did not need to announce themselves. She had a meeting with Daniel Chen at 2 o'clock to review the investment trust structure she was building for the next phase. She picked up her pen and went back to work.